Well, welcome everyone back to the next podcast of the Digital Transformation Whisperer series. So hopefully you enjoyed what we have published so far, and that you're actually finding that the content is helpful to you. Today we're actually talking about digital literacy, and so it's interesting because we talk about literacy, but as I have found over the years is that different industries actually make up terms, or they use terms that we would associate with a certain meaning, but then we actually find that that term actually has nothing to do with the meaning that we associate it with. And so it's really interesting to actually delve down into what that meaning is, because if we are thinking something and we are assuming something when we sign contracts, we may find that our assumption is actually vastly wrong from what the actual intent of the actual clause or the term or the meaning actually is. And so for us, it's about saying, well, how do we actually navigate that? How do we get across what that is? In today's world, in digital transformation, the marketing people and the spin doctors have created a number of terms that mean something, but obviously it's something different when we actually start looking and delving down into the information. And so it's very, very, today's topic is talking about, in the digital literacy series, it's talking about cloud. Cloud's a simple type term that often we use. Lately, probably if we've been in northern Queensland, we would know that clouds produce a lot of rain, and so. But the clouds we're talking about today is not that weather kind of cloud, and so let's delve into what that is. And as I mentioned, with the digital transformation has a number of different terms, and so one thing I thought I'd delve into is really what do we call those things? So from the English language, we call them a homonym, where they have multiple meanings for the same word. And so today we'll talk about cloud. We've got a series that we're going to talk about different things like pre-configured, the best practice processes, artificially intelligence enabled. Another one's machine learning capable, global template. And people think, oh, global template, that'd be pretty good, because obviously everyone's working off that same template. Must be great. Enterprise platform is another one. And even there's one that we've got out now, which is coming across as called compostable ERP. What is that? Compostable. We know what compost is, but does that mean it's the same thing as in the ERP? So these terms that we have, there's many of them, and with a number throughout the series that we have, we'll actually delve into each one of those terms. Today, I think the discussion centers around cloud. And so what is cloud? So, when we listen in the media, everyone's going to cloud. If you own an Apple or an Android or those sorts of phones, you might find that in the old days, you stored all of your photographs and all of your information on your phone. Whereas now, companies like Google and companies like Apple and those sort of companies are saying, well, we've now got way too much data we're trying to keep and store. We need to actually have a cloud instance. And so what you'll find is that many of them say, well, you can put your photos in the cloud storage. What does that mean? Do we just put it up there? How does that actually work? And so that's what we'll talk about with this session today. Often there is the challenge when we talk about cloud and not understanding what it actually means, that someone could actually use our information that we're no longer storing, either on our phone or in our server that we have in our server room. We're actually using that as someone can actually access that information that we don't want to access. And so things like privacy settings, things like access settings, things like, where we actually have to have different methods of being able to access the system. So it may be that we have to put a code in, or maybe have to put different information in just to prove that it's actually us accessing that system. And so let's start off with the first term that we talk about when we talk about SAP, or when we talk about, not necessarily SAP, when we talk about cloud instances. And so often you'll hear the term SaaS, subscription as a service. And so subscription as a service says that instead of us having, to have it stored on our phone, or buy a CD and actually load it onto our computer, we actually pay a subscription fee to actually access that. And so Microsoft is a classic. If we have Microsoft Office today, many times we download a key code, and that code allows us access to the Microsoft Office suite. And so that could be your Teams, that's your Word, that's your Excel, any of those. Google does the same thing with Google Sheets. And so that's just a subscription. So we pay that either monthly or yearly. Well, the same thing happens with software. And so we've now got a view where, if we're having an ERP, instead of us having an ERP where we download it onto a server, we can actually have that as a subscription as a service, a SaaS offering. There's a number of challenges with having a SaaS offering. And so you can imagine in the past, you would download and you'd have access to something. You might set up your preferences differently. In the old ways, when we had ERP stored on servers, we could actually do customizations so we could make it look like what we wanted it to look like. Whereas now we've actually got subscription as a service. We're saying, well, we want to be able to have that the same for everyone because, as we'll discover, there's another term which we'll get down to a little bit later, which is multi-tenancy. And so multi-tenancy says we've got heaps of people all on this one type instance, and we're just subscribing to that instance. And so essentially that's the difference. So we want to have very common. Why is this a pitfall? So if we look at, and SAP is a classic in this, and so I do refer to SAP a little bit because, SAP probably started in the world of ERP and they had on-premise platforms. And now there's a preference to actually move to the cloud and have SaaS offerings. And so for them, it's about, in the past, it's been customized to suit what you need. But in today's world, it's about saying, oh, no, we don't want you to customize. We want you to be able to use. So can you adapt your business to actually be work the way that we would like it to work using the processes we have built into our system, baked into our system? Because we've got hundreds of thousands of people, organizations that are actually going to use this system, and we can't accommodate having every little variance that we would like to have included in the system. We need you to be able to sort of fall into what we would have as a standard as such. And that way, when we actually put out an update, we actually do a bug fix, we do any of those sorts of things we plan to do over the life cycle of software, we can actually just roll that out. And so, if you've owned, like I said, go back to if we go back to the Apple world, the Apple world is where we overnight they'll put out a bug fix, and often we'll find that bug fix actually comes in and changes things around. All of a sudden we've got a bigger box here, or things are in a different place. Well, they do that, and that's part of that subscription service, is that we will accept that they will push out updates and changes to the system whenever they choose to. The same thing for the software vendors. And so whether it's an Infor, an Epicor, or Oracle, SAP, any of those who have cloud services now, a subscription as a service, talk about having updates coming out at least every quarter, sometimes 6 months. And so, when we talk about a quarter, that means that every quarter we could have something in which is going to change the way we see our system. It might be that we've got things in a different place. We might have, the way we use it. There might be additional features we're actually pushing out. And so subscription as a service is one of those things that it really does change our view on how we have software. Software is not something we buy now. And again, in the case of SAP or Oracle, we might have had that software for 15 to 20 years. Now what we have is a version of software that will be uploaded and will be ongoingly changed, updated, improved, features pushed out. And so whilst we've got that subscription, we actually have access to that. The minute we stop that subscription, we actually then lose that. And so there's a few things that we need to consider when we do that, is the fact that we've got data stored. So where does that data go? Can we just take it and put it somewhere else? Is it in the format that we actually might need for the new platform we're actually going to have to move to? So, some organizations might go from being a Microsoft Office to a Google Sheets. So in that, I've got a lot of documents that are stored. So if I want to access those documents, I need to be able to say, how can I actually move that data or that information that actually I find precious to me and store it somewhere else? And these are some of the questions that we don't really understand when we talk about cloud, because Cloud seems simple. Cloud is actually a large database somewhere else. It actually doesn't sit in the cloud. If we look at it for Microsoft, we look at it for AWS, which is Amazon Web Services, or we look at Google. They've got data centers globally. And so in Australia, we've got a number of data centers for Microsoft and AWS that actually satisfy the need of many providers that say we want to keep our data and our information local. We don't want it stored overseas. Other customers don't care. They'll actually say, well, we're happy to have our data saved somewhere else and stored somewhere else so we can actually access it as we need to. And with the advent of the internet, browser surfing, access that way, we can actually, doesn't matter where that data center is, we can actually access it, and usually with a good level of speed. So those sort of things are options that we actually have. But there are also challenges that happen when we're actually looking at saying, well, if we find that data precious and something like an ERP, there is a lot of transactional data in there. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of records we've actually got to keep. And so if we're having a SaaS service, when we stop that subscription, that's something we need to be able to consider as part of our after SaaS with a particular provider. We may go to another provider. The challenge there is, will the data that we actually are transferring be able to be used? And I worked with a client just recently where, that they'd stored copious amounts of data. They're a huge utility. And so, but the problem they had was, and they were protecting their data, they decided that, okay, we'll keep our data in multiple different databases and with different providers. Then all of a sudden they said, well, we're going to actually uniform and have our whole system on one platform, and we're going to use one system to access all of that data. We'll put a data lake in as such. Well, because they hadn't thought of the implications of that, that created a number of challenges. And so for them to actually have this perceivable data lake that sits in a data center in a cloud somewhere, it made it difficult because there was all of these false walls that actually sit in there, these barriers that actually help with security, but stop the flow of information. And so, thinking cloud, thinking data centers, thinking data lakes, all of that sort of stuff is something that we need to delve down into a little bit more, because the simple term cloud is used often. And so when we start looking at that, well, if we're going to have a cloud service that is a subscription as a service, we have limited options of change, and often what we have is limited ability to be able to say where we're going to store that, because it's usually the software vendor has either an in-house or they have an arrangement with a large provider like a Microsoft, like a Amazon Web Services, who will subcontract some of their cloud data space or their data center to a particular provider. So it's still all in the cloud, but it's not necessarily where we might think it might be in the cloud. Another option that we have, and this is for organizations that are coming off of on-premise. And so on-premise storage is where we have a server that actually sits within our building, or it may be our own particular data center we have if we're a larger organization. And so we have to actually manage all of those servers. We've got a team that looks after that. If we've got any faults that the database isn't working and not storing the information, or we can't access it, or we need to do an update, we've got our own internal team who does that. But what we do have is now a term that they call infrastructure as a service. And so in software, especially in ERPs, we have what we call the application layer. And the application layer is what we see. When we log in and we actually log into finance, or we log into human resources, or we log into any of those, they're actually called applications. And so those applications sit on top of a database. And so what we do is we say, well, we're actually going to have those applications available to us, but the data is actually going to be stored in a third-party data center in the cloud. So infrastructure as a service. So the infrastructure is actually the database and the ability to be able to use those applications sitting with that database. And so all of a sudden, I might own my own applications. I might own licenses that are perpetual licenses that allow me access to that information and use that system. But the data is actually stored in a data center. And so no longer do I have the constraint now of saying, well, I've got a server that is a certain size and a certain capacity and holds a certain speed. In in infrastructure as a service, I can actually say, well, I might want some more. So can I have a contract that allows me to be able to scale up and scale down on peak times and things like end of year, end of month, when we're doing high transactions in an ERP, we're actually having more capacity. And so do we actually need really the highest level of capacity all the time? And so what this allows us to do is to buy a smaller capacity, but have a term with the provider to say, well, at certain times of the year, month, whatever, I can actually have extra capacity to me, and I just buy a block of it, and then when I use that up, I'll buy another block. And so it's a much simpler way to be able to get affordable storage and capacity with that flexibility you have, because on premise, one of the big challenges you have is about saying, well, if I'm going to have high peak loads, I need to have my server system be capable of actually managing that peak. So that means I could have that 80% of the time, my server room is not really working at capacity. But there might be that small time at the end of a month, end of a year, where we actually are working at full capacity. And so I need my server set up to actually do that. So I've got a huge amount of redundancy actually in there. Whereas when I go to infrastructure as a service, I can actually say, well, let's have a smaller amount of what it is, but have that flexibility, that elasticity, as we would call it, to actually increase my processing speed, my capacity as I need to. And often one of the big challenges that we have when we talk about cloud is that, and moving from, say, an on-premise database, is we may have had 15, 20, 30, I know organizations that have 30 years of transactional information stored. Not for any other reason, but they can't decide what they should keep and what they shouldn't. Or it may actually be that they are in a long life asset intensive industry, and they need the history of those assets over time. Utilities have this where, they'll have power lines that will last 60 plus years, 70 years. And so to be able to work out how often it was worked on, to be able to get the intelligence of what maintenance practices were used, what materials were used at certain times, that data could be used at a later stage. But the challenge with that is if we just store data everywhere, the problem we have when we go to the cloud is we need a huge database, and that becomes costly. And so the question often comes for organizations is that data, do I need that data to have it on tap all the time ready? And if I'm looking at my financial information and I'm looking at taxation compliance rules, it might be that I need that data to be hot and available. So I want to be able to access that when I can. There might be times when I'm looking at it and saying, well, do I need the data, sometimes yearly, we're doing, 2-3 yearly planning. Do I need to be able to access data there? So you might call that, medium or lukewarm type data storage. You actually will put it into. And if it's that you actually don't access it a lot, but you need it for audit reasons, you need it for historical confirmation that you've actually done certain works. And so, there are certain industries that actually need that information. When you go to the cloud, it's about saying, well, what should the rule set be to actually store data that might be like that, where we need to access that at a later stage to prove we've done something, but we call that cold storage. Because the other thing that's important, not only are we storing data in the cloud, there's also a cost of retrieving that data from the cloud. So if we have all of that data on tap and available to us, but we don't use it, we might use it every 10 years, then the cost of storing that data as hot data is quite expensive. And so we'll have these various terms. And so you can see there's a lot more thinking that we have to do if we're going to what we call a cloud data center. And so that's things that we don't consider when we hear the salesman talk about, we're just going to put this in the cloud. It's going to be great. I've talked about two different instances there where we talk about, SaaS, and we talk about infrastructure as a service, IaaS. And so these are things that we have. And then we're also, now we're actually starting to have it where we've got what we call PaaS. So PaaS, platform as a service. So instead of just buying the applications, we're actually now going to buy everything. The database, we're going to buy all of the access, we're going to buy the capacity we have. And so some software vendors have decided that they don't want to be able to have a third party come in like an Amazon or like a Microsoft Azure or Google. That they don't want that to happen. What they'd prefer is actually the customer be tied to them, so their applications all sit there. They have much more control over the spend, one bill. And so what they offer is this PaaS system where it's platform as a service. It's almost like a subscription, but you're getting everything. You're not just buying the applications. There's a big challenge of that in the sense that, if we look at the old world of perpetual license, on-premise type situations, we actually had something. We had a license. In the SaaS world, we have an access right. So that access right allows us to be able to access the particular application. And we do have some decisions we can have about where we store that software on the database or the information. When we get to a PaaS, we're actually outsourcing that completely. So the minute we actually have that platform, or we want to change that platform, there's a number of extra things we have to consider. The database, the information. It may be all of the integrations we might have where we're linking the system into the platform. And so the PaaS really is one of those things that you need to really think about when you're actually doing that. So if you're a large organization, you may consider that as a way of removing risk. But it also is one of those things you have to consider, what is the consequence of when we do change our mind, when we are different in the way we actually want to work. We actually want to change providers because what we're using today is no longer current, even though the software vendor is managing and maintaining our system and they've been doing upgrades as they are. There's some extra features that we actually might want from a different provider. And so to change from a PaaS type scenario is a lot more involved. And so it's a key thing. The other thing that often happens with the PaaS situation is that the software vendor then determines the capacity that you have. And so it takes us back to that view where, in the past we had an on-premise situation where we had servers that could meet the ultimate capacity we might use. The way that they sell the PaaS option is they will sell you that based on that capacity, because in the background, they probably don't have their own data center. They're actually going to an Amazon or an Azure or someone like that to actually rent space in that cloud data center that's out there. And so for them, they buy blocks. And so those blocks of capacity are a maximum capacity that you would have. And so sometimes it's worth doing the evaluation to determine if I'm buying a PaaS system and a platform as a system, am I buying more capacity than I need? But it's not actually giving me the ability to scale up and scale down. And so often what we've had and what we've heard and seen is that customers who take on a PaaS situation find that that wasn't calculated well. They didn't know how much they've grown. They've bought another entity, and so that's doubled the size of their need. And so to actually provision more capacity or more data, they've had to actually request a lot more, and that's not easy. And so it's not something that happens. And so I have heard of cases where it's up to 6 months to get a new provision of this additional space. And so you don't really want that if you're actually looking at doing things quicker than that, or your needs change and you want to remain flexible. So there are things to consider when we talk about the PaaS, platform as a service. Another term that we hear is managed private cloud. And so a managed private cloud is probably the next step from IaaS. And so what it says is I have my applications and I can set myself up with a private cloud. So instead of having everybody accessing my particular piece of the data center, the applications in my data center, it's just for me. So it allows me then, if I want to actually do things like customizations. If customizations are very, very important to you as an organization and they're a competitive advantage, then that might be the case. And you do find some organizations where, standard vanilla ERP or HCM, human capital management, CRM, we need a bit more. So we actually do need to add some extra things in, some extra functionality. And so having a managed private cloud is something that is appealing to many. The other thing it also allows us to do is help with our security. So all of a sudden, I've got my own managed private cloud, so I can limit the amount of people who access it, and the risk of someone trying to find a backdoor or a way to actually access our information becomes a little bit harder for the hackers, but better for us in that safety factor. And so it costs a bit more to have a private managed cloud, and it allows some options available to us. So if you're a larger organization, it is definitely one of those options that we might look at and say that suits what we need. Multi-tenancy. And so when we talk about multi-tenancy, and this is interesting because there are a lot of platforms now that have come out that to be able to reduce the costs of maintaining software, updating software, bringing out new versions, what they'll have is a multi-tenancy access. And so something like, say, a Workday or a SuccessFactor, which is an SAP product. Workday is a Workday product. And so what you find there is that they will have one particular platform, and they will allow organizations globally to access this one instance of software. And so when it comes to updates, also updating is that instance of software. There is some flexibility in it in the sense that you can actually set your preferences. So it's not that every organization who's actually accessing that multi-tenant software has to have everything exactly the same, because it allows them to be able to, there might be certain features or certain configuration sets that they will have that are unique to that particular organization. They're usually limited. There's not a lot to it. You can name some different things differently, but as such, most of the people that are on it will have the same type of, they're using the same code, they're using the same instance, they're just all accessing it. And the personalization is that it's their own organization is what they see when they access it, but in the back end, it is the same code. And so that multi-tenancy is one of those things that customization is something we don't want to be doing. Definitely, there's a preference not to. We store it on a multi-tenanted cloud platform or data center, and so that's how we actually manage the system, and all of the updates come through that way. And so if we like multi-tenancy, that's great. And there's some instances where the world doesn't need to be different. There's not a lot of competitive advantage if we're using some type modules which are like HCM. All of a sudden we've got employees, we've got employee information. We might do some modules like recruitment, we might do onboarding, but largely they're all done a similar way. We have some slight preferences or people who we use, but the base code and the base way that we actually go about it is similar. And so that's why multi-tenancy works. When we talk about ERP, if I've got a simple business that's not so complex, then a multi-tenancy ERP may be the answer. So that's a decision that we can make. But you might find that if we're a large organization, multi-tenancy for things like our ERP, like our financials, like those sort of things, where we've got a number of different entities, we have multiple currencies, we have all of those sort of aspects that we have to deal with, then multi-tenancy may not be the best way for us to go. So we may want our own private cloud instance, which allows us to be able to be set up that way. There's that safety that actually goes with that. So you can see that just in the discussions we've had, cloud, there's lots of meanings of cloud, and there's lots of things that actually we need to consider when we talk about cloud. And so this concept of simple, easy is something that when we actually get to the point of really understanding it, and we need to really understand it, because the consequences of us changing our mind later is different, in the sense that all of a sudden, we can't get out of contracts as easy. We have this data which we need to actually keep operating. If we are going to secure another instance after we've actually moved from another, we need to be able to say, well, is that data easily transferable in there? Do we need to configure? Are we losing all of that, what I call intellectual property? But it could be modeling, it could be the way we've got our preferences set up. It could be any one of those things. Can we actually just lift and shift that information across? And not likely does that happen. It's not as easy as that was what we find. And so, everybody jumping on the cloud wagon now, in 5 or 10 years, there are going to be some issues that they're going to have to consider that they weren't aware of when they started. And they weren't aware of the fact that, oh, gee, what do I do now? How long does it actually take me to shift from one platform to another? Who's actually going to do the testing to confirm all of my data and information has come across to the new platform? Was there any data in there that couldn't come across? Where's that go? Who's going to store that? Because I'm no longer paying for a subscription to a provider. It's not like having a server sitting in the back room and saying, well, that's okay, we can just keep that going and we can access that as we need to. We can just download that or draw some information out of it. We no longer have a relationship with that provider. And that's the big challenge that many people don't consider when we talk about subscription services, when we talk about cloud providers, and if we look at the big three, your Amazons, your Googles, your Microsofts, they are probably the biggest in the market now. But in 5 years' time, with the rate of change of the way we store data, the type of systems we're going to use, will that still be the case? And so there are things we need to consider when we talk about cloud and what we're actually doing. And so it is it's not an easy type situation to talk about. The thing we do find when we talk about our legal getting our legal team to actually look and review contracts, what we find is there's a lot of terms that that are built into those contracts that even our legal professionals don't understand. And many of them, that they understand the legal terms, but what's the intent of some of those terms? And so, and that's what you need to really understand and discover. And we've had occasion where we've actually gone back to the software vendor and said, hang on, you've got two modules here. You've got a mobile module and you've actually got a standard platform, and the two actually compete with each other, because I might have someone who's actually putting sales information into my system as a third party, and you're charging me for that to happen because it's an extra license or extra access as such. But then in your other system, you actually need named licenses or named subscribers. And so the two actually conflict with each other. And so later on, if they were to do an audit or to do a check on how you're actually using the system, you may be up for additional costs. And all of those contracts were reviewed and understood, so we thought, by the legal professionals. But the legal professionals don't understand the intent. And sometimes where even software vendors don't even understand their own terms and agreements. The salespeople will give you a view to satisfy the situation. If you don't delve into it, it's not until you actually call upon this change to happen, or you're actually presented with something which is forcing you to actually deal with the situation that's arisen, that you learn that, that didn't mean that. That actually meant this. And now I'm liable for additional cost. And so they're the sort of things that we need to consider when we talk about cloud. It's not like just saying, I've bought some hardware and that's my server. I'm going to put it in the server room and I have complete control over that. Now I actually have a third party who has control, and they have terms and conditions, and they have meanings, and they have classifications, and they have clauses that actually all have their own interest at heart. And so when we're signing up, there's less about the fact of, we care that you're actually going to stay with us, yes, but when you move, we don't care as much because you're no longer our paid, you're not paying us anymore. And so this is that shift of understanding when it comes to dealing with cloud platforms, dealing with cloud providers, dealing with software vendors who offer cloud services, because information for us is king. It's like if I lost all my photographs on my phone today, I'd be devastated because, quite frankly, I've got about 10 years worth of photographs that are valuable to me. I worry that they've gone to the cloud. And so for me, I've got my own cloud service, little that they make me pay for. So hopefully that, in my mind, gives it some sort of safety. But as it is, do I know? I don't. And so what happens when if I change my phone from Apple to be Samsung, maybe. So what happens there? Are my photographs still available to me? So these are questions we need to consider, even from just a single user. When we get into the world of digital transformation, these are even more complex, because we have organizations that, whether they're government entities, whether they are security agencies, whether they are large global miners, whether they are banks, all of that information is highly, highly important. And as we've seen recently, where we have breaches that happen where, like Optus, people have accessed the database. They've had that in the cloud. So how do they access that database? Usually it's because the hackers have found a back door. So this is the real thing that's important for us when we're considering that cloud is the case. And a utility, electricity utility that we'd been discussing with a few years ago, had the option of go to cloud, and there was a concern that maybe not. And when I look back at them making the decision where they actually took on an on-premise, they built their own server rooms, and then I look at some of the breaches that have happened more recently, you start to wonder whether that was a really safe decision for them at this time, when security is probably not as robust and not as strong as we would like it to be. And so it's one of those things that when we are making these decisions, ask people that can give you an answer. And even if that answer sounds plausible, just check it for a sense check with someone else, because what you might find is it's conflicting. If it's conflicting, that means it's not a clear answer that you have. And so it's very, very important for you to be able to get clarity on what your decisions are. Today's term was cloud. When we start looking at different types of terms, we'll learn different things. And so we're starting to learn the language of digital transformation. And digital transformation, like any form of industry as such, has its own terminology. A few years ago, I had to learn financial terminology because I was building a business and dealing with banks, and some of those banks have different terms and different agreements. And so how do you deal with that? Understand their language is the key thing. Being digital literate is something that is vitally important. And the more and more that we actually have ERPs and digital platforms becoming front of center, as against in the past we had it sitting in a back room, we used it, we accessed it, we changed it every 20 years. Now we have updates every quarter, every 6 months. So no longer do we have it as a back room anymore. It's actually something that is important for us and becomes visible to us in a much more shorter time frequency. And so digital transformation isn't just set and forget. It's about understanding what you need, what your terms are, what the meanings are, what the intent of those are, and making the best decision as a result of that. And I've worked with an organization that was moving a data center from one country to another, and the level of detail that we actually could go into those contracts to actually preserve when we did make that change, when we actually did shift from one provider to another, was really quite interesting, because you can actually make those changes. As much as the software vendor goes, well, or the data center owner goes, well, yeah, that's okay, but we can't see that happening. In their case, they could, because they had a plan, they had a strategy that they were going to change providers in the longer term. And so they needed all of those safety nets in there. And so delving down into the information that sits in contracts, putting terms in that actually suit you, is a really great way to go. And so it's important that you actually think about it that way if you are of the size of organization that makes sense to. So I hope today's session has been quite interesting. Cloud is not just the weather, as we've discovered. There's lots of different meanings to cloud. There's lots of different intent. There is lots of different ways of seeing cloud. And when we no longer want to stay with that particular cloud provider, there's a few things we need to think about on the way. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you want to join another one of our podcasts, and we'll discuss digital literacy and a different term at another time. But today was cloud, and so hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to speaking with you again. My name's Wayne Holtham. I'm the Digital Transformation Whisperer. So thank you very much, and have a great Christmas.